Okay, on this episode of the Tortilla Cat Files, I want to talk to you about the Jamestown Colony. Now, you remember we talked about the Roanoke Colony and how it was the first colony that the English, or the British, settled in what would become America, and it disappeared, so it was a failure. The next time they formed a colony was the Jamestown Colony. The charter for the Jamestown Colony was granted by King James I. It was given to the Virginia Company in 1606. Now, remember, the charter is the paper that has all of the rules and the king's permission to be able to form this colony and the rules by which the colony is supposed to run on it. And it's like a license. You have to have this charter to be able to have an official colony. So in 1606, in December, about 100 colonists left England and started off for North America in 3 different ships. They landed at the Chesapeake Bay near what is now Williamsburg, Virginia. Scout's going to be joining us, apparently. They formed a government or a council, and the members of this council included Christopher Newport, who was the commander of the sea voyage. I guess he was one of the captains, and also Captain John Smith, who was a soldier and a mercenary, and actually had gotten into trouble on the voyage by being accused of an insurrection or an attempted mutiny, which is, a rebellion, basically. I can't find where anybody writes about what he was upset about. It's not like you're in the middle of the ocean, there's not any land, you can't just pull over and get out and go get a Coke or anything. So I don't know what the deal was there. And without a whole lot more research, I haven't found that out. But when they arrived at the site for Jamestown, they opened up the box with the charter in it and found that it had listed off the names of the people who were supposed to be on the council, who were supposed to be the governing body of the colony, and John Smith was one of them. So they had to let him off of being in trouble, and now he's in charge. Sometimes that's what happens in life. It's kind of odd. On May the 13th of 1607, they found a narrow peninsula in the James River. And you remember, a peninsula is a piece of land that sticks out into the water, and it's surrounded basically on 3 sides by water and only connects to the land on one side. Think of Florida. Florida is a peninsula. We all know what Florida looks like. This was a much smaller peninsula because it's not a whole state, but it only connected by a really small piece of land. They said it was technically almost an island, that the connection was so thin that this was almost an island, and they decided that was the most defensible position for them. So that's where they began building their fort. Their fort was built of wood, and it was in the shape of a triangle, and it was surrounding and protecting a storage building for them to keep all of their weapons. Remember, all of their weapons had to have gunpowder, so they had big barrels of gunpowder. That's not like, now you have just boxes of ammunition. They had to kind of basically mix their own, and so they had to have the gunpowder in the great big barrels, and they had to store that someplace where it's not going to get wet. So they had to build a storage building to put all of this gunpowder in. They also built a church and started building houses for the settlers. And all of that was inside this triangular shaped fort. In the summer of 1607, Christopher Newport and about 40 men took 2 of the ships and went back to England. They were going to petition the king to see if he would send more settlers and give them some more supplies, because they realized, we got over here and we are not prepared. There is no land that is prepared to be plowed and planted. Everything is forest. All of that forest has to be cleared. The trees have to be taken out. The stumps of the trees have to be dug out. Any rocks and everything that's in there has to be taken out and moved somewhere else, so that now we have land that we can plow. England has been settled for hundreds of years. There is no land that's not left a forest except on purpose. And so they are unprepared when they get here and step off into America. And it's like, this is not what we were expecting. So they have nothing ready. And all of this, clearing this land takes time and a lot of effort. And all of this time that they're using to clear this land, they are not planting crops to get them through the next winter. So they are already in trouble. And they're beginning to realize it. So they're sent for more supplies. Now remember, it takes a long time for these ships to go back and forth. So they're hoping that this ship, that the man will get back, Newport will get back with supplies in time for the winter. While all of that's happening, the settlers that were left behind were suffering with hunger because, all they've got for food is what they can catch, what they can find in the forest, and what they brought with them. And what they brought with them is a limited amount because you can only put so much on those ships and you eat a lot of it while you're on the ship on the voyage. So there's not a lot left when you get where you're going. They also were suffering from diseases that they were catching from drinking contaminated water. They were located on this peninsula in kind of the middle of a swamp. And I don't know if you've ever seen a swamp in real life, but swamps are places where the water is usually stagnant. It means it's still, and still water breeds a lot of diseases because animals come and drink there. They do other things in the water that contaminates the water. The insects lay their eggs in the water, and so there's stuff swimming around in the water that you don't really want in your body. And that's what they're drinking. If you're ever lost somewhere in the forest, if the water is running water, if it's a river that's running fast, it is usually fairly clean unless there are chemicals that are in the water from factories and things, and there's no way to see that. But usually you're fairly safe from insects or a lot of the different types of germs in running water. Any other type of water, you have to boil it before you can drink it. These people didn't know about that. They didn't know about germs. And so they're just drinking all this nasty water and they're getting sick, and a lot of them are dying. John Smith, and they always are having problems with the Algonquin people who already lived in the area, who oddly enough didn't really care for all these new neighbors that they hadn't invited coming and setting up shop and, tearing up their land. The Algonquin tribe is under Chief Powhatan. John Smith and Powhatan at some point in 1608 actually reached an agreement. John Smith was captured by the Native Americans, by the Algonquin, and taken to the village where Powhatan lived. This is in some places where we get the story of him meeting Pocahontas and her saving him from being killed. But there's problems with that story, and we talk about that in a separate video about Pocahontas, that John Smith kept a diary when all of this was going on, and he mentions meeting Pocahontas and talks about him talking to her. She was a very young child. She was about 11 or 12 probably, talking to her and her teaching him some words in Algonquin, but he doesn't write about this story about her saving him and keeping her father from killing him. He doesn't tell that story until about 40 years later. So you got to wonder, if this is a good story, dude, what if this has really happened? How come it's not in your diary? But we'll talk about that more on the story about Pocahontas. However, they did come to an agreement, and trading does take place between the two cultures. The winter of 1609 starts, and somewhere along in that time, John Smith was injured when some of the gunpowder exploded, and he was pretty severely injured apparently, and so he had to return to England. He was the main one who was friendly with the Algonquin, so this is going to already start a problem with the Algonquin. The winter of 1609 was extremely harsh. It was a very cold winter. If you're in Texas, think about February of 2021 when everything snowed and everything shut down and the power grid went out. And I don't know about you, but here in the town where I live in Devine, we had no power at all for 4 days. These people didn't have power anytime. And so this was an extremely hard time for them. And they actually referred to it as the starving time because they haven't been able to raise a lot of good crops yet. They don't have a lot of food. There are firsthand reports. Remember, firsthand reports are from people who were at the scene, who saw what was happening, and who wrote it down right after it happened. Those are firsthand reports. A secondhand report is somebody goes and reads a story about, what happened, or talks to someone about what happened, and then they report it. They did not see it themselves. But firsthand reports, all of these people wrote letters. A lot of them kept journals, and a lot of those things survive, which is weird when you think about it. But a lot of these people, the firsthand reports talk about people having to eat their pets. If they had brought dogs with them, very few cats made it across in the ships for a long time. Cats were kind of at a premium for keeping mice under control. A lot of them boiled their shoes and ate the leather. How hungry do you have to be to eat your shoes? I'm just saying. And some of them actually resorted to cannibalism. Cannibalism is where a human being eats another human being. It's where any being eats the same thing as itself. That's cannibalism. They were not catching people and killing them to eat. They were eating people who had already starved to death. So, that's a hard decision to have to make. I'm not going to judge them, but, I'm thinking, yeah, you have to be really, really hungry to make some of these decisions. So you can kind of see how hard this winter must have been. Over 100 people died. New colonists had come in, so there were more than 100 of them at this point. But over 100 of them died during this winter alone. In the spring of 1610, they were actually prepared to load back up onto the ships that were still there and leave Jamestown and go back to England. They hadn't done it in the winter because it was very difficult to travel across the Atlantic Ocean in the winter. That was the time when there were lots of storms, and it was a very harsh way to travel. So people did not travel on the sea in the winter if they could help it. That's one of the reasons they didn't try to leave before the spring came. But just as they're making the decision that, this is it, we're done with this nonsense, we're going back to England, another two ships arrived from England carrying 150 new settlers and a whole bunch of supplies, and the new colonial governor, whose name was Lord de la Warr. He almost immediately became ill and went back to England. He left Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale in charge. They did not care for the Algonquin people at all, and they did not want to honor any of the agreements that had been made with the Algonquins. And they actually began raiding and burning the Native American villages in the area. This didn't go real well with the Algonquins, so now there's not much trading. They don't regard each other as even remotely good neighbors. They don't like each other at all at this point. By 1611, the colony had managed to finally grow a decent corn crop. Corn was the grain that they grew to pretty much use for everything. In modern times, what we use in almost everything is wheat, but back then they used corn. Corn was what they made their bread out of. They made cornbread. Corn was what they fed their animals. They ate corn. They cut corn up and put it into stuff. Corn was a huge crop for them. They had actually learned the techniques for successfully growing corn from the Algonquin people, who now they're not talking to. They had also learned to insulate their buildings that they were building using tree bark between two layers of wood, put a layer of tree bark. They had learned that from the Algonquin people. But they're feeling pretty good about themselves now. They've got a successful corn crop. So they start expanding out of just the original triangular fort into other areas. And they call this area Newtown, because I guess we just can't have a more original name than that. In 1613, the relations with the Algonquin tribe were extremely bad, and they actually began what they called the First Algonquin War. During this time period, Pocahontas was lured onto a ship and was kidnapped. She was being held until the Algonquin people, Powhatan, her father, agreed to release some prisoners and agreed to leave the area, basically, which he was not prepared to do. She ended up staying on this ship for several months. During that time, she was supposedly converted to Christianity. She took the name Rebecca instead of Pocahontas. And in 1614, she married a man named John Rolfe, who was a tobacco planter. And he actually had introduced a new type of tobacco that was grown from seeds that were from the West Indies and then planted in Virginia. And it was a much more hardy crop. It grew a much better type of tobacco, which they could then harvest and send to England. And so this was an economic boom for the colony of Jamestown. In 1619, the General Assembly was formed. It was consisted of all men. Women were not allowed to serve on the General Assembly. And the only people who got to vote for the men that were on the assembly were men who owned land, who owned property. This became the basis for pretty much the system of government for all of the colonies in the area, which carried over and became part of the basis of the government for the North America when it became the United States. So if you weren't a man and you didn't own property, you could not participate in government in any way. This cut a lot of people out. About that time during 1619, 50 African-American men, women, and children were brought to the colony. They had been on a Portuguese slave ship, which was captured in the West Indies. Remember, we talked about Prince Henry the Navigator was one of the first ones who started having people capture African people and bring them and sell them as slaves. They were not regarded as slaves here in Jamestown, but they did work as indentured servants. Remember, the difference between an indentured servant and a slave is that a slave, you're pretty much born a slave at a certain point, but you become a slave and you have no way out of it unless the person that owns you decides to let you go, which is very unusual. Indentured servants, it's a contract. You make a contract with this person. They feed you and house you and pay you a little bit of money, and you agree to work for them for so many years. And then after that so many years, you are free and you can go and get another job somewhere else. That's what these people were, these African people were. And they basically spent their indentured servant time working in the tobacco fields. In 1622, the Algonquins under Chief Opechancanough, who was Powhatan's successor, he had apparently died by this point, attacked Jamestown. They were angered by the colonists that were taking more and more land and expanding all the time into land that belonged to the Algonquins. Diseases that the white people had brought from Europe that the Algonquins had no antibodies for. We're learning about that with the COVID virus. A new virus comes into the area. Nobody has any immunity to it. And so it just kind of goes through a population and a whole bunch of them can die. That's what was happening to the Native American people when the people came from Europe, bringing different germs that their bodies had never been exposed to. So they're not happy about that. And this was a brutal attack when they attacked Jamestown. They killed between 350 and 400 colonists. It was about a fourth of the population, 25% of the population is wiped out. In 1624, James I dissolved the Virginia Company and made the area into a royal colony with Jamestown as its capital. The original fort was now abandoned, and people continued to just move out into the surrounding area and expand. In 1644, Opechancanough, who was now in his 80s, they believe, led another major rebellion, but this one was not a success. His successor, Nicotawants, was forced to sign a peace treaty, giving up almost all of their land and requiring them to pay an annual tribute to the governor. A tribute is like a money offering, kind of almost like a tax that they were having to now pay to these people who came in and took their land. In 1675, a governor was appointed named William Berkeley. He was not very popular because he was imposing higher taxes during a time when tobacco prices were declining. So you were getting less money for the tobacco that you were selling, but you were having to pay more of it to the government in taxes. This is never a happy place for anybody to be. He made a scapegoat, which means he blamed a lot of these problems on the Native American people that lived there. And a tribe called the Doeg tribe actually was raiding the colony at this point. So Berkeley set up a meeting with this tribe, and while they were supposed to be meeting as a peace meeting, he had a lot of the tribal leaders killed during this meeting. Then he forbade the colony, to trade with what he was calling the hostile tribes unless they worked for him. So basically, he's creating a situation where he's making money off of the fact that the Native Americans are unhappy, and he's set it up where he's going to make money off of this. A distant relative of his named Nathaniel Bacon demanded a commission or permission to be able to fight the Native American tribes. He was not given this because the governor doesn't want these tribes to be wiped out. He wants them where he can still use them as a threat, and he's still making money. Bacon and a volunteer militia that he raised decided to go out and fight the tribes on their own. The governor named him a rebel, but he returned back into town or into the colony, and he was elected to the assembly, and he brought his militia in, and they surrounded the state house and forced Berkeley to resign. He then set fire to the state house and set part of the colony of Jamestown on fire. Eventually, word had gotten back to England, and it was now King Charles II, and he sent troops to put this rebellion down. And so that was the end of the first rebellion by colonists on American soil. It's not going to be the last one. In 1698, the State House caught fire somehow and burned down. This happened a lot. These buildings were all made out of wood, and they lighted them with fire or candles, which are open flames, and a lot of stuff caught fire and burned down. It just was what happened. They decided not to rebuild the State House in Jamestown, and they actually moved over to the neighboring village of Williamsburg, and that now became the colony's capital. People still lived in the area where Jamestown had been, but the actual the town of Jamestown was basically abandoned. The peninsula that was known as Jamestown Island, eventually during the Revolutionary War and during the Civil War, actually had military outposts stationed on it. That peninsula is still there, and it's now a part of the National Park System. And I suppose if you're in the area of Williamsburg, Virginia, it might be cool to go over there and look at that and think, this was the first place where there was a successful colony in the United States. That's all I have for you today on Jamestown. Scout is up there surveying and supervising, doing a good job up there. Let me know what you think about this. Let me know of anything else you'd like me to talk about. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.